Thank you for joining us. This is the Church of Ambrosia Podcast, number 3. Today we have Robin Carhart-Harris, who is a professor of neurology and specializes in psychedelics. How would you describe yourself?
That really, I say I'm a psychedelic scientist, and I have for a while, actually. I like to just name it, Even before it was sort of comfortable, if not trendy, to name it as, psychedelic research. And you've got to put it out there.
Yeah, well, great. Well, you're doing great work at UCSF, and for anybody that doesn't know about the work that you've been doing, because, again, our church is a bunch of churchgoers who aren't necessarily up to the latest in science. But what have you been doing through UCSF?
Well, let's see. We're about 3.5 years in now since I joined from Imperial College London. And so it takes a bit of time to get momentum up, but we are now. So we've got quite a few live studies. The flagship project would probably be our set and setting project. Now, for most people who know psychedelics, set and setting is like, a cornerstone of how to safely and beneficially take psychedelics.
I mean, it's absolutely one of the most important things that we talk about in the church. And, we get a little lost sometimes in psychedelics calling it set and setting, but set is mindset, right?
Yes.
You got to be in the right state of mind going into these and in the right environment.
Yeah. And like so many things, we could broadly define mindset. It could be all sorts of aspects of one's psychology.
Yeah.
And maybe an obvious one is expectations, your mood at the time. But then you can go deeper, and keep going in a sense in terms of your individual psyche that you bring. And even the context of what you're doing it in. Context is the magic word, really, because that everything collapses down to context. Set and setting is context in all its varieties.
Yep. Yeah. One of the big things that, I talk about is, sometimes actually when you're in the worst state of mind, you feel like the world's piling up on you. Those can be some of the best times to do some of this work. You just have to be in the right environment, and you have to do it intentionally.
There you go.
Right? It's not if you're trying to have a good time at a music event, but your world is falling apart. Yeah. And you do the psychedelics, you might realize that it's trying to bring that up at the music event.
Yeah, psychedelics have a funny way of finding you out.
Yeah.
What's under the hood, what's there really, and you might want to have a good time, but if, I don't know, a recent breakup or whatever it is playing on your mind, then you could feel pretty sure it's going to come up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if that is something that you want to address, for what we talk about is the right set and setting is a comfortable environment, where you're dosing with somebody around to be your sitter. They don't need to interact with you. They just need to make sure that that the environment is safe. So.
Yeah. These days, I mean, set and setting, we could go on the whole episode probably about all the different aspects. You can break it down to the preparation, and then, the supervision. So a sober sitter with you, ideally, and then the integration work afterwards, the psychological aftercare. But there's so many different aspects to it. But, these days, through thinking about not just the research that I've been doing, but also thinking of tragic cases, we call them... they're outliers, really. Yeah. When we do research, we're often looking at the average, and on average, people are benefiting from taking psychedelics. And on average, probably most people are paying some attention to set and setting, to some degree.
To some degree. But, again, you think you're going to have a good time at a music festival, or actually probably one of the worst things that people commonly do is they'll be drinking at a bar, and then somebody will say, "Oh, you want to try this mushroom chocolate bar?"
Yeah.
And that's not a good mix.
No, that's not good preparation.
No.
On the spur of the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so there's a lot that can be controlled and tested, but impaired judgment is probably I would probably say the main risk with psychedelics. I'm realizing these days, there's a lot of there's a lot of myths and myths of varying sort of severity in a sense, or distortion from reality, the reality of the actual risk. Triggering psychotic disorders, I suspect that that's inflated in terms of the prevalence and prevalence where it truly has been caused by the psychedelic and not by some, extraneous factors, individual vulnerability, other drug use, all sorts of things, sleep deprivation, life stress.
Potentially even the stress that's leading you to take the psychedelics,
Yes.
Yes, you were already there.
If wrongly you're doing it for some escapism, for some avoidance, and as we said, psychedelics have a way of finding you out.
Right.
Yeah. So, but impaired judgment is a thing, and that's why I do think, and it's not just towing the party line. I really believe it that sober sitter, and I know in certain cultures this isn't necessarily the way things are done, but. We're in a Western culture right now, and I think, and outside of the system to some extent still, I know things are changing. And so, baby steps and having a sober sitter adhering to that principle, given the impaired judgment, I think is a essential aspect.
It's very important. So I mentioned before we started that the church does high dose work, this breakthrough dose up in the Oakland Hills. We actually do 2 sober sitters to 1 person on the psychedelics.
That's great.
A male and a female, just so that there's accountability in both energies there. Not in a relationship together, so that there's nothing funny. They're people who have done the work themselves and are there to keep the safe space. But the goal there is actually we put you in a room by yourself. So we don't interact with you. We're just there so that if the building catches fire, if we hear a loud thump, and at all points there's somebody who knows what's going to happen to you there to take care of you, but they let you go deep into your own work. And quite frankly, I think that is the best way to do them myself, but I know there's a lot of different ways people practice with them. And I think the key with anybody who's going to do mushrooms together, they really, one of them should have done them before and knows be the expert in the situation and knows how much they're taking and what's going to happen.
Yeah, like the Sherpa who knows the mountain range,
right.
Bill Richards would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, and that's quite a classical model, at least classical to psychedelic therapy. Maybe not to generations past in terms of psychedelic plant medicine, but. We're all kind of repurposing things and history repeating. But in terms of, say, 50s, 60s and Groffian psychedelic therapy, it would be two sitters' guides to a patient or individual journeyer.
Yeah, well, and actually there's many different cultures who have used these tools in many different ways. So, although the one that's most popular right now is group settings in psychedelics, there's many cultures that would send you off into the jungle. Yeah. Right. You take a bunch of psychedelics and then you go bond with the jaguars.
Right. A vision quest. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, I think that there's plenty of different ways these tools can be used in different contexts, but that, for science and for me, the most important thing is for the deep work, it's all about you getting into yourself.
Yeah.
So if somebody else is in the room, that's a different energy into the room. If somebody is trying to guide you through it, that's not the guidance you're getting from your soul.
Yeah. So it's so deep, it's so rich, all these setting elements. But what we're doing in this study at UCSF, as I said, our flagship study, is to control set and setting. So, we share these assumptions, set and setting. It's really important. We hold those assumptions quite dearly, don't look too favorably on cases where it's breached that principle. However, in science, that you have this interesting tension when you're testing something, because you're manipulating, you're controlling to ask a question and answer a question as crisply as possible.
Right.
Yeah. So everything has to be pretty tight and controlled so that you can answer your question pretty confidently. That's the ideal. Strong inferences is what you say.
So how do you do that with set and setting?
Well, quite. So we control it like you control. You got questions about a drug. Is this drug what's its effects? Well, you take into consideration things like expectations. So you control for those potential confounders by having a placebo.
Right.
So you repeat a lot of the procedures when giving a placebo. If you're doing a double-blind study, meaning the participant or patient and the staff or the therapist don't know what's actually in some capsules, say, then that's double-blind. And so you have your placebo, you have your active drug controlling for all these different elements that could get in the way of making a strong inference as to what caused what. You wouldn't know if it was just a kind of snake oil-esque positive expectation, like a self-fulfilling prophecy that, for example, got you better from depression or got rid of your pain. You wouldn't know if that was just a self-fulfilling placebo effect or whether it was something direct in the drug that caused it. So that's controlling for the drug factor. And we do that. So we have high dose psilocybin, 25 milligrams, standard flat dose. We could talk about that.
Yeah.
And then placebo, match weight, match capsule. It's identical other than what's inside. So that's controlling for dose. So how do you control for set and setting?
Yeah, right. Because the dosing is kind of obvious, but like, are you moving the couch in a different part of the room or like what?
So the way we've done it is to use the fabulous space that we have down in Mission Bay in San Francisco, beautiful new center, the Weill Institute for Neurosciences, an amazing clinical research unit. The rooms are beautiful, but they're incredibly clinical. And the lights, they dim, but they're still like ceiling fluorescent lights. The beds are clinical beds, so they look clunky and they're robotic. There's a clock on the wall that ticks. Everything looks nice and pristine and clinical, and it's okay if you're going in for a general checkup, but many hours in that room without music. So here we go, without music in one of the conditions. It's staffed consistently across the two conditions. Controlling for drug, you have two conditions, drug versus placebo. Controlling for set and setting, we have two conditions. We call them unenriched, which is what I've been describing, and enriched. Enriched is a lot like psychedelic therapy as we know and love it and think that it can be incredibly beneficial and therapeutic. So music listening, the psychological preparation, the rapport building, the therapeutic alliance, the compassionate support during the session with principles of letting go, of inquiry, of confronting, going in rather than going round, all these things, all these wisdoms in a sense. And then the aftercare, the integration. So that's the enriched package. It's psychedelic therapy. So the unenriched is to strip a lot of that away. And so you hear this and you think, oh gosh, that's kind of daring. And this is where science can be daring, to test an assumption that guides so much of this work, but not all of it. And we get it, but not everyone does. And for different agendas, different reasons, they start to question it. One reason is it's expensive. So can we dial it down? Well, nobody really knows because they haven't systematically tested it.
Yeah.
So we're doing that in this study. So we're controlling drug versus placebo, unenriched, enriched set and setting, and we're looking at the interaction between those two factors with two levels. You call it a 2x2 design. And so the short story, the high level would be we're testing the hypothesis, the prediction that set and setting, enriched, unenriched, really matters when you've got a drug on board. It matters less when it's placebo. It'll still matter, but its importance is exaggerated under the drug.
Yeah.
And that invites all sorts of other questions like, well, Why? Does that tell us something? First of all, is that true? And if it is, what does that tell us about the drug? And, it's a strong hypothesis, we feel, because these drugs promote plasticity. Plasticity means sensitivity to context.
Yep.
It means changeability, malleability. It's synonymous with sensitivity to context. So it would make sense if set and setting really matters under drug versus placebo, and that is what we're testing.
Yeah, well, that is really interesting because, again, compared to the work that we do with the God Sitters program, we're actually a lot more like your unenriched setting. So the context that I tell people before they go into the dose is think of a question so large that only God or your soul can answer it. You get one question and just focus on that. Ideally, it's something simple that you can repeat over and over, but that sets your mindset as I'm going into this to get this question answered. And then we put you in a room with a bed on the floor and nothing on the walls and no music. And that's because of the dose that we're trying to give people, which is, I think it'll be good for us to talk about the standardized dosing that you're doing compared to what we're doing. But we're going for where we call the start of the breakthrough dose is closed-eyed strong visuals. So you close your eyes, you see a lot of stuff. You open your eyes, you're in the normal environment. From there, it goes to the point where open-eyed visuals, you can see things in the room with you. You're hearing sounds and voices and getting direct messaging in what is almost hard to describe with words. But at those levels, the paintings on the wall and the sound getting played completely affect the dynamic of the experience. So there was this man who did high-dose mushrooms for almost 50 years, Kalinda E., who unfortunately passed away at the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, tomorrow, the 10th, is the anniversary of his death. But the work that he did and the stuff that he talks about, it's the leaving your body in the context that we've done since ancient times. This is where you go to the realms of the gods and explore the multiverse and go to these sides. But when we're doing this work, if there's a painting on the wall, you can go into that painting. And if that's what you intend to do, and that's a sacred artifact that's designed for you to go in and explore the knowledge that's in there, that's one thing. If it just looks kind of cool and then you get sucked inside when you're trying to answer this large question, it actually becomes a distraction. So it's really interesting that's your control is the therapy almost versus what we do. We just do it on a much higher dose.
Yeah. We don't do this in super vulnerable people. We've done our anorexia trials and chronic pain and severe treatment-resistant depression. We've done all that. This is in healthy people. And I do it with quotation marks because they have lower than average well-being coming in. So we don't want people who are super flourishing in life, riding high on how good life seems to be, because there would be no scope for change.
Right.
And that's one of our main outcomes, we call it. One of our main, results that we're looking to measure is a change in well-being. Well-being is a generic index of mental health, and predicting big improvements in well-being, especially in the psilocybin enriched, condition of the 4 conditions. So that's where we think the secret sauce is. We think it's in a synergy, a positive interaction between these pro-plasticity drugs, making you more sensitive to context, and then getting that context right, enriching it so that you can get the best possible outcomes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and definitely, so in this study, you're doing just across the board 25 milligrams.
Yes, 25. Flat dosing, you can question it. It's convenient.
Yeah.
And there's so much individual variability and just, general sensitivity that if we got, clever and tailored it by body mass, I think it would overcomplicate it in this particular
in the study that
study.
you're doing, yeah.
Yeah, it's a big study. It's 120 people. I've done some fairly big studies for what we call investigator-led trials or studies. This is, one group at one institution come up with an idea, manage to get enough funding to do a study. That's kind of my track record. I don't do multi-site clinical trials sponsored by a drugs company or MAPS or whatever. So these investigator-led trials are often relatively small. So, the biggest trial I've ever done to date would be 60 people, a head-to-head psilocybin versus Lexapro for depression.
What was the outcome in that?
Well, 95% of outcomes significantly favored psilocybin, but one missed. And when you're at the driving range, you've got a bunch of flags, and you're saying to your buddy, I'm going to hit that flag. That's called pre-registering your primary hypothesis. I'm going to go for the red flag. You can't do it after the fact when you hit your shot and you actually land next to the green flag, and then you tell your buddy, I was going for the green flag.
So still 95% is a pretty good thing. And,
it's damn good thing.
Right. And when you're comparing the side effects of the two, psilocybin, the psilocybin experience is 4 to 8 hours max.
They each have their own side effects profile. I would say sort of different. It was 6 weeks of escitalopram, Lexapro. But you still get a bit of, blunting, emotional blunting, bit of sexual dysfunction and other things like gastrointestinal stuff, and anxiety actually, was there, sweating. So, some stuff that bothers people and affects their quality of life. It might take the edge off their depression.
Yeah.
Their depression, their low mood might feel less intense, but unfortunately, everything feels less intense. And for many people, it's not worth that kind of, mollifying of life and the richness of a lived life. So,
I think there's another thing too that we've seen, which is that, the psilocybin experience is you have the experience, and then you don't necessarily need to do it again for a while.
Well, this is it.
A daily dose.
6-week trial, 42 doses, I think, of Lexapro every day. Drug always on board, maybe starting to wash out in your sleep, but daily, always on board in waking consciousness. Whereas psilocybin is 2 doses in the same 6 weeks, 2 doses, 25 milligrams, 3 weeks apart, and the drug's washed out your body. So it's a much less drug-dependent model, which is a funny old thing when you think of stigma around drug. The drug condition here is the Lexapro one. I think it's not, it's not divorcing drug, it's not divorcing biology at all. It's just acknowledging psychosocial, it's acknowledging therapy. You can very legitimately call it a more holistic, integrative model. And I'm a believer in the problem being, multifaceted, as in mental illness isn't just biologically caused. It's not some genetic abnormality driving the disorder. That kind of idea hasn't been very successful in psychiatry, by and large. Very much lacks any specificity, at least, that there's a gene or a series of genes for particular disorders. It hasn't panned out.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at life adversity, and particularly childhood adversity, it's a much stronger predictor of later life mental illness. So complex problems need I would say sophisticated, multifaceted solutions. Not blunt tools, but sophisticated tools. And I think psychedelic therapy is a more sophisticated treatment for mental health problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, I'm coming from the perspective of the church, so we look at things a little differently, but very similar. It's just, for us, it's all about getting you in touch with your soul. Mm-hmm. So the best therapy, the best therapist is actually you directly interacting with your soul, because you can't hide anything from it. It knows everything you've been through. In the context that I talk about it, your soul is something that lives outside of space and time. So it knows everything that you've gone through, and it knows everything that you will go through. It knows why you came here, and it knows what you're supposed to do. So if you can get in touch with it and get the answers directly from it, things like depression, that's a side effect of you knowing why you're here and what you're supposed to do and what your soul is. But it's great to look at it from every perspective, and I love to see things where science is testing some of the stuff that we're directly seeing by having people use it.
Yeah. Well, it's healthy to be pluralistic, isn't it? And if you go to depth psychology, then the soul, the psyche, it means the same thing. Psychedelic, soul revealing, psyche revealing, psychedelic, that's what it means. It could be revealing the personal psyche, and you think of people like Sigmund Freud and going back to, your relationship with your mother or what have you, life traumas, repression, and so on. But then you go to Carl Jung and the collective unconscious and archetypes. And so it's all there.
Yeah.
It's all there in the soul, and the problems are there in an unwell soul, and the answers, the solutions are there in a redeemed or refreshed or regenerated soul, in a sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's, again, the exact sort of thing that we're seeing with the breakthrough dose. I think the thing that's really kind of significant in the difference between what you've been doing and what we've been doing is the level of dosing. So, you're sticking at 25 milligrams across the board, and I speak about everything in micrograms, but the conversion is just multiplied 5,000. So just for easy purposes right now, I'll just talk about everything in milligrams.
Yeah.
The breakthrough dose that we've defined, where it's close-eyed strong visuals, that starts at 20 milligrams per 100-pound person. Now, there aren't that many 100-pound people that are doing psychedelics, and I wouldn't imagine that you've had too many, maybe during the anorexia studies, but too many that are at that 100-pound or less. And then the effects that are really good with therapy, where you actually need somebody in the room with you to talk you through it, that tends to be in this range, again, for the 100-pound person, somewhere between basically 1 milligram to up to about 19 or possibly even 20 milligrams. But in that range, it can be really helpful to have a therapist work with you to walk you through the things. Once you get past a certain point and you leave your body and you're dealing with things that are beyond this world, the therapist in the room is just going to see you sleeping, or what they appear to be you sleeping, or just talking to something that they don't see that apparently is in the room with you.
Yeah.
And at those levels, the therapist, from our perspective, is your soul and the thing that's on the other side. But below those levels, where you're still really in your body, that's where I think some of the most effective therapy, because you can actually have somebody trained to talk you through what you're going and help you dig into some of these things. But just to give you, again, some numbers, the highest dose that I've done since we've been tracking Potency and the actual psilocybin level of the mushrooms was about 144 milligrams.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Which is way too much.
I would. Yeah. You probably.
That's what actually led us to start doing the testing and look at this body weight ratio.
Yeah.
But for me to reach the start of my breakthrough point, so I'm about 260 pounds. So that would be roughly about 56 milligrams. And that's close-eyed strong visuals for me.
Right. Yeah. So that's high. I mean, I have known of a case, pure psilocybin. Let's see. I believe it was 125 milligrams. So at that dose, that's huge.
Yeah.
I would say a risky, very ill-advised. We wouldn't advise a dose that high.
I mean, unless the person was really large, I wouldn't say that high.
Well, the case that I'm thinking of was an accidental overdose, and there was some, the next day, and I think the following day as well, there was some blood in the urine. The experience itself, this individual tolerated psychologically remarkably well, but this person had quite deep experience. There was confusion, but it wasn't that different to the confusion that you can see with 25 milligrams or 30.
Yeah.
So it seems to hit a kind of asymptote to sort of, it seems to sort of probably saturating the serotonin receptors, But then, you go over a certain range into this overdose range, and you can have negative impact on peripheral organs, and that was the peeing of blood. But the dose makes the poison, and psilocybin, remarkably good therapeutic index, we say, so a therapeutic dose to a toxic dose.
Yeah.
It's quite a big window, but there's no good reason, at least from the controlled studies, to go above 30, 40 milligrams. 30 is, we consider, a high dose, but it may be that you're going higher than those doses.
We definitely go. Well, again, it depends on body weight. So what we've really seen, and that's one of the things that I think is a little different in what we're looking for versus what you're looking for. So what we're looking for is where the start of the closed-eyed strong visuals. So you close your eyes and you see more than you can imagine, more than you can describe. And that's the start of the breakthrough dose. So for me, that's about 52 milligrams by about, we'll say 77 milligrams. That's about 150% of my breakthrough dose. That's where the environment is so real. It's like you and I sitting down, and you're talking
like a DMT
to
experience.
Well, actually very similar, which is something else I wanted to touch on, is like, what have you done? Well,
we could go there. Yeah.
So there's also something, so that space, like a DMT experience, but it lasts for about 2 hours.
Right.
And then there's something else that we've noticed that will lead into us talking about DMT. So because that's the spot that we're looking for, we tend to shoot low on it, on the breakthrough dose for the first time we're doing it.
Yeah.
And what we found is we can add a little DMT, have somebody take a couple hits off a DMT pen, and that takes them for the full breakthrough experience that lasts the duration of the mushroom trip. So generally the DMT breakthrough is 15 minutes, but when combined with psilocybin, it can be 2+ hours.
That's interesting. I'd never heard that before. That is interesting. I mean, this is pretty next level compared to what we do in the studies. The doses that you're listing are higher than we tend to go. Of course, listeners, viewers might be struggling with the translation from milligram psilocybin to gram of mushroom.
Which is another big thing that the church has been pushing, because what we've seen is a 1:80 ratio in potency. So some mushrooms are 80 times stronger than others, which, if you're talking about, so to get to 25 micrograms or 25 milligrams with a mushroom that's 1%. So 1% works out to be 10 milligrams per gram. So to get to that 25, that'd be about 2.5 grams.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's been a classical rule of thumb, hasn't it?
Which is one of the things that actually I think kind of threw a lot of people off, because what we were seeing for the original mushrooms that the church was getting when we first started, most of them were testing around like 0.2 to 0.3%.
Okay, quite low in psilocybin. Yeah.
So it comes in. Everybody's heard of or most people have heard of the 5-gram heroic dose. Well, if you're looking at a 5-gram heroic dose on mushrooms that are 0.2, 0.3, maybe in best case 0.4% compared to 1%, there's a huge difference there. And even crazier is there's some mushrooms that have tested over 5%.
Yeah.
Right. So to get to that 25 milligrams, that's 0.5 gram of mushrooms.
Yeah. So it's a huge, error margin, meaning it's very unpredictable how strong your mushrooms are.
Yeah.
That's a problem. And you must have really come across that in terms of quality control. You want to provide the best information to your clients about the strength of the product that they're buying. And it can be hard if they're, and this is one of the issues with the situation that we're living in, where much of the psychedelic use still isn't legal, it isn't controlled, and so that kind of quality control is hard, and it's sad because it introduces more risk.
Yeah, well, and I think that's actually one of the biggest risks that there is with psilocybin is the overdose. And what we've seen from the overdose, because I'm not talking about the physical symptoms, there's when somebody goes too high. So just going back to that ratio, if somebody who's this 100-pound person does 20 milligrams they're going to come out fine. If they do 40, they're going to have an experience that's so intense they may never want to do them again.
Yeah.
And even worse, so there's two stages that we focus on in what we call the overdose, which is the first one is you don't remember what you did.
Yeah.
So if you don't remember what you did, why'd you do it?
Yeah.
We're trying to go into the soul and ask it questions.
Yeah.
So you just had this incredible thing that you don't remember what happened.
Yeah.
And then the second danger is when you go too high too fast, because it's really important with this breakthrough dose work is that you work your way up slowly. You don't just go from, okay, I've done, in my case, 50 milligrams once, and now I'm going to do 100 milligrams. That's a horrible jump. We work people up slowly over time to get their bodies and them used to these experiences. But when you go way too high, way too quick, that's when you see things like what we describe as the mushrooms taking over your body. Right. And people do crazy things like rip off their clothes and try to run down the street naked.
Well, it starts to sound like other compounds like 5-methoxy-DMT. And I can hypothesize at least mechanistically how it can happen. If I put some jargony sort of psychological terms on it, I would say what's happening there is that the psychedelic enriches phenomenal consciousness, the richness of subjective experience, what it is like to be, is dialed up, to 11. It's rich as hell, wild as hell, and there's so much content, and it's so changeable. That's phenomenal consciousness. But there's another dimension of consciousness we might call ego consciousness or access consciousness, the ability to remember the content of the trip, to be able to tell it back. To have any sense that you're a human being even. And so those very high doses you're inducing these unitive states, pure consciousness like states, extremely rich phenomenologically, hence the term pure consciousness. Yet something is lost at those doses, as in there's a loss of ego consciousness, total loss of ego consciousness. And then, so it depends what you want. A lot of people seem to get something very profound from those experiences with 5-MeO or very high doses of
again, as long as you remember what you did, then you'll get something profound out of it. And it's interesting the way you describe it, because that is kind of what we've witnessed directly. Since we've been doing all this work, we've taken people there accidentally. I've gone there accidentally. I haven't ripped off my clothes and run down the street naked, but we've had some rough ones. But the one of the interesting things is and this is why we say the mushrooms taking over their body, because when they're ripping off their clothes, it's like the sensation of air on their skin. It's like the first time they've ever noticed these things, and the feeling of, their skin, and often they'll touch themselves a lot and just be really fascinated that they have skin. And that they're in this body thing, and then the sensations on the body. So it really kind of fits with what you're describing of going to this level of consciousness to the point of you're not really conscious, and there's something else there that's now every sensation that you have is puzzled by it and is fascinated by it.
Puzzled by, because it's novel again. You know, it's when you remove your blinkers and have pure experience, it's like being a baby again. It's quite Groffian in that sense. Back to Adam in the Garden of Eden, wonder and awe at all things. And perhaps horror. Heaven and hell.
I mean, you wouldn't, if somehow there managed to be a baby running down the street naked, you wouldn't necessarily think that there was anything wrong with the baby for running down the street naked. It's more, how did the parents let their baby start running down the street naked? So, definitely a lot more childlike.
Sounds like a wild trip for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So DMT. So what have you guys been doing with it? What do you have any? Have you been doing anything with it?
Not live at UCSF, but through colleagues back in London. Chris Timmerman. We set up the DMT work when he started his PhD. He's now a postdoc and going on to lead a research program and so on. But he's been doing some of I would say, the world's most pioneering DMT research, human brain imaging with different modalities, combining EEG and fMRI. That's a particular study that I think both of us are very proud of. It's the first time. And
somebody was on DMT?
On DMT, we give it IV in that study. So it's a bolus IV injection and then shot into, hyperspace, into the DMT world. Half of people having entity encounters, feeling like they're in the presence of some other elaborate, being or beings. Very archetypal, I think, very of the collective unconscious. Others go beyond that to sort of, you might say, supernatural ideas of transcending dimensions and so on. I don't know. I tend to understand it from Jungian psychology, but it's weird as hell.
Well, again, those are the realms that we focus on in the breakthrough dose with mushrooms, because you can reach those same places with the right dose of psilocybin.
Yeah.
You just have to make sure you're ready to go there.
Yeah. Do you know the whole game that people like me do of trying to map the weirdest subjective experiences with psychedelics? It's a funny old game, and I think people lose sight of what we're doing sometimes. And I'm starting to realize it's what philosophers would call a map territory fallacy, as in the map isn't the territory. When we map brain activity, first of all, we're looking at the brain through the constraints, the limitations of our tool. So we might only be able to see activity within a certain temporal frequency, certain wavelengths, maybe really slow wavelengths with fMRI. It's really slow. We can't pick up the fast stuff. Or we record EEG, and there we can pick up some fast waves, but not that fast. They top out around sort of 50, 60 hertz, and then we lose confidence that what we're recording is actually brain activity and not some kind of muscle artifact, for example. So we're limited there. Also with EEG, we can't see deep into the brain. We only get a smudgy picture from the cortical surface. So these are tools to map the brain, but we're not seeing the territory, really. We're seeing it through the map. So it's a map territory fallacy that I think people often don't really get. And it actually relates to something in consciousness science that's called the hard problem. How can you explain the arising of subjective experience from brain activity? And I think what people struggle with there is that they mistake this relationship between subjective experience and brain activity because of a map territory fallacy. They think the territory, subjective experience, can be got at or should be got at, through the mapping, like territory to territory, but it just doesn't work that way. Will it ever work that way?
Well, I think we need new science to get there. Because the context that I look at this stuff in, and there's a couple interesting things there, but the context that we look at this stuff in is you're leaving your body and your consciousness is interacting with the larger you that is your soul. And that's what's guiding your experience and showing you these things in the breakthrough doses. But there's also something kind of interesting that you said as far as what timing you're able to capture, because there's a very common thread of anybody that does this deep work, and same with DMT. With DMT, it's 15 minutes, but people will often say it was like days, weeks, years. In the stuff that we do with the breakthrough dose of the mushrooms, same thing, but longer. Because again, DMT is typically 15 minutes. These experiences can be 2 hours. So it's not uncommon for somebody to say, it's like I've been gone for 10 years or 20
many
years
lifetimes.
or 100 years, or time is not real. So like for part of the problem to be that things are moving so fast,
fast,
right? I mean, how fast does light move? I'm sure none of your equipment could pick up things happening that fast.
We think that's a limit.
Yeah. But the electrons in the brain, or whatever physical things might be happening, it would be hard to, if your tools are in this timeline trying to scan it.
Yeah.
They might not be able to show the 100 years that you felt passed versus the 2 hours that you were scanning.
Yeah. What is that? But I jumped on fast because brain activity and normal waking consciousness, it'll exhibit a number of different rhythms, and they nest into each other. There's slow ones, and within slow ones are nested faster ones, and in them faster ones still. What psychedelics seem to do actually is actually dial up especially the higher frequency rhythms. And that's started to be seen very clearly in animal work, because in the animal recordings, you actually get into the brain matter. And so you can record with more fidelity, better resolution. And so you see those faster waves that in a human skull, with its thick nature and the way it smudges the signal, we can't get at those faster rhythms. So we're a little blind until Neuralink or whatever it is starts to record brain activity under the influence of psychedelics, which they'll
trust me,
matter of time.
I would love to be able to bring my own AI assistant into these psychedelic spaces that I'm going.
That's a matter of time too. There's a lot of possibilities for machine learning and psychedelic science. That's another study we're doing actually. That was our first study that we're coming close to wrapping. I could tell you about in a moment. But just to finish on the fast thing, these days these are pithy remarks, partly because I'm writing a book, so it's nice to come up with short and sweet little phrases that say something, say a principle. I say psychedelics are psychedelic because they break chunked stuff down into smaller bits. So it's finer grained. Temporally, patterns in the brain are finer grained rather than coarse grained.
Yeah.
Normal waking consciousness, you see these big patterns, like the default mode network is a very popular network system in the brain that people often refer to.
Well, and there's something about it shutting down with...
Yeah, it doesn't shut down. Yeah, that's sort of sloppy language. Maybe I used it once upon a time, but I don't these days. It doesn't shut down. It scrambles up. It gets entropic. It gets bittier and its boundaries break down, and it bleeds into other systems. So it doesn't shut down. Nothing shuts down under a psychedelic. You can sort of shut the brain down with an anesthetic, but you don't shut the brain down with a psychedelic. You scramble it up. It's a dysregulation. But yes, you're breaking chunked stuff, so coarse-grained stuff and slow stuff, down into faster and finer activity. Spatiotemporally, it's faster and finer. And I think that's why psychedelics are psychedelic, psyche revealing, seeing more content, because naturally it's like a data decompression. You're taking your zipped up file and unpacking it, unzipping it, and all this stuff now.
And that definitely could explain the time dilation that people feel.
Because there's more stuff. It's like going on holiday and all this novelty, and felt like I was there for, a month, and I was there for 3 days or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the way we perceive time is a very interesting thing,
isn't it? And things seem longer when we're really young, and then time speeds up as we get older because novelty drops away, sadly,
Well, also if we're really bored or really trying to pay attention, like the
takes forever, right?
The pot will never boil if you watch it, that sort of thing. Versus if you're having a good time, all of a sudden it's been 2 hours and you're like, oh shit.
Time flies.
Yeah, it's definitely been a burden of mine in this world. There's never enough time.
There isn't so much to do. Those are the good times when you feel that way.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. When you're having a good time, there's never enough time. When you're not having a good time, man, I can't wait for it to be over.
Yeah. You want time to fly in a sense. But that machine learning comment, so the first study we did, we called it Insight 2. and it's wrapping up now. We need 2 more volunteers. It's a study for psychonauts who are happy to go into an MRI scanner, wait for it for 15 hours in total, 12 of
15
which,
hours in the MRI?
5 in the MRI machine, in total over 4 visits.
Oh, okay. Well, that's still, what?
It's a hell of a lot.
3, 5, no, 3.5 hours ish per.
Yeah. And it's chunked up. Like, people go in, they come out, they use the restroom. So, you know.
What psychedelics are they on?
It's psilocybin. It's 4 doses, 10 milligrams, so low, moderate, and then 3 25s. And usually with a week between the doses. So I'm unpacking this study because we're still recruiting 2 more people. We want to get to 10. It's not a big sample, but it's big, or rather deep, within subject. So we get a ton of data, as you're hearing, 15 hours of fMRI data per individual. So you call that deep sampling. So, you know, you can have big data across a big population of people, like a population study, 100,000 people, whatever, or you can go deep within an individual and get 15 hours of fMRI data. So we're doing deep sampling within an individual. And why do that? Well, the aspiration is to get enough data such that we could predict their subjective experience from what's going on in their brain.
Yeah.
So that's you call it a sort of reverse inference process, or decoding process, not how the experience is encoded, but now wanting to decode from the brain and predict the experience that someone's having. So the sci-fi version is mind reading, and people have been doing it with fMRI actually pretty close to here. Jack Gallant at Berkeley's been pioneering this kind of work for many years, decoding what people are viewing in movies. So predicting the content of what someone's viewing in a movie, predicting the content of dreams, even predicting the content of imagination. Yeah. So now we're wanting to predict the content of trips.
That's really interesting. One of the things that's kind of interesting too is the dosing pattern that you're using. One of the things that we've seen through this high dose work is how quickly the tolerance builds up and how long it takes to fade. So for this breakthrough dose, we tell people it has to be at least 3 weeks between doses. Otherwise, we see a tolerance effect. And again, the thing that kind of helps us see it a little better than the doses that you've been doing is we're looking for that close-eyed, strong visuals. So if somebody doesn't get that, they know. And we'll know because they'll be like, I'm just sitting in my body and I feel a little weird. I'm kind of bored. But when we reach that point, they aren't bored. They close their eyes and they see more than they need to see.
Yeah.
But there's a 3 weeks tolerance buildup. So one of the things that we have through the church's website is a dosage calculator based on your body weight, your tolerance, and the potency of the mushrooms to tell you how much to take. Yeah. But there's probably something there that, I definitely cannot do this math in my head, but that the 25 milligrams a week later after the 10 would be almost the same effect as, we'll say it's about 15 milligrams. Right? Because there's a tolerance there.
Yeah. And we'll probably be able to pick that up. I guess, because the sample's not huge, it's small, 10 people, and that's, we're not even there yet.
Yeah.
We don't really have a lot of people to reliably test and demonstrate tolerance in this particular study. But, there's other studies.
I mean, if you're looking for people, I can send it out to the church's list, and there's a bunch of psychonauts on there that.
Well, bit of 10. Opportunism here.
Yeah.
That would be good. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
The other thing, it would be the third study in our live studies, just about to launch, is we call the study Cohort 3. Because we've had cohort 1 and 2. This is real world data collection, naturalistic data collection, ideal for the services that you guys provide, where we threw online surveying, but short and sweet. No one wants to do your goddamn survey, so everyone's time's precious. So make it short and sweet. We do that. We call the project the short and sweet version breezy, brief and easy. That's the promise wherever you are, Oregon, Colorado, Oakland. People's time's precious, so make it a light lift and get the essentials. So 3 time points before, just after, like the next day, not during the trip because that's, sacred time.
Yeah.
And then 1 month later. So just 3 time points, probably about 10, 15 minutes per survey. That's about as brief as we can go and still get meaningful data. So it's the lightest lift we can do, and the hope there is to get really big data, broad data, from a really big population. Really utilizing these opportunities through what's happening here, what's happening in Oregon, and now it's going to be happening. Well, we know it's happening, whatever the legal system, increasingly in the States. It was a 10-fold increase in first-time LSD use was picked up in a survey project within 8 years. 10-fold exponential increase in LSD, first-time LSD use, and I think that was published a few years ago now.
Yeah.
So that's probably an underestimate. I don't know if it's still increasing at an exponential rate, but anyway.
I mean, the church saw a huge number of members coming in, new members during the pandemic. That drove a lot of people. So you're trapped inside. You don't have anything to do. You're all dealing with anxiety and other things going on. That's it's actually a great time to do this sort of deep work.
Done right? Yeah, for sure. So anyway, that's another project, and we have a version called Bay Area Brains, which is inviting local people to the Bay Area to come in and have their brain scanned before and after mushroom use and first time. So we're interested in how the brain changes when you turn on to psychedelics. So these would be people who were entirely naive to psychedelics, taking them for the first time. We're not promoting that. They have to be doing it through their own accord. Yeah. But if they're doing that, let's make it science and collect some data.
And did you have these set up for people to already participate in?
Yeah, we're going through, third round through the IRB, and it's really just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. They're very supportive. IRB is the ethics approval, the approval to do this research. So it's really, I would say, certainly weeks, probably not days, not months, weeks until we launch. And then it's about marketing and making it visible. So yeah, we might.
As soon as you have it ready, we'll definitely promote it to the church.
Fantastic.
I mean, we've introduced a lot of people to mushrooms for the very first time, and I'm sure there's a percentage of them who would love to have their brain scanned and participate in some studies like that.
And it's educational. This is what science is. It's an unknown there. Does turning on to psychedelics, turning on to mushrooms for the first time, what does that do to you? What does it do to you psychologically in a big sample? Yeah. What does it do to your brain? Does it change your brain? We've got some preliminary evidence that first-time psilocybin does change the brain. Actually, anatomically, it may change the brain.
It completely changed me. We opened actually as a cannabis church, and shortly after that, Oakland passed the lowest priority for all entheogenic plants, and that the mushrooms had been calling me for a long time, but I didn't actually try them until Oakland passed their lowest priority. And I had to try them before bringing them into the church. I won't go into my whole path that got me into these large doses, but the mushrooms brought me there and was following the guidance of them. But before mushrooms, I believed in cannabis as my only connection to spirituality, but I wasn't necessarily comfortable about talking about God or your soul. Through the work that I've done, these really big breakthrough doses, focusing on questions like, what is religion? What are you mushrooms? What is my soul? Who am I? What am I? I'm now completely comfortable talking about what God is and what your soul is, and that you actually came here for a purpose. It's without a doubt made me way more religious than I was, and not to say that I didn't already have a deep connection and still have a deep connection to cannabis relative to my own religious beliefs, but without a doubt in any way, shape, or form, the mushrooms completely changed my life and who I am.
Mm.
Not in a bad way.
Yeah.
You know, in the most appropriate way for why I came here and what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Well, you know, How to Change Your Mind was a great title, Michael Pollan's book. How to Change Your Brain, or we need something cute there, but, you know, that side of it, how do people change sort of physically, physiologically? That's a big unknown. You know, we've got a fairly decent handle on the psychology, and we know it's rich and wild as hell. But you could say that that's been done pretty thoroughly, you know, whether it's from Aldous Huxley to Benny Shannon or, the varieties of psychedelic experiences. I mean, there's so much literature, Michael Pollan, on the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience. Like, that's been done, dare I say it, to death. But the black box, you know, how does this work physiologically? How does it work biologically? Even though it's a map, and we shouldn't confuse a map with the territory, but the maps aren't very good. Like, you know, I'm probably one of the few who has the best idea of how this is working through the lens of human brain imaging. And I'm telling you, the maps are pretty rudimentary. We're picking up some principles, the entropic brain effect, breaking down chunked stuff into bittier pieces and faster activity, faster and finer, more content. That's, you know, that's carrying this increased richness of content, the faster and finer. But we're just scratching the surface, you know?
Well, and, you know, I think eventually science might get to the point that we can actually understand and have things that dip into other dimensions and our soul and some of the stuff through quantum physics that, you know, might explain some of the things that are beyond this reality. There's also, have you heard of this professor out of UC Irvine, Donald Hoffman?
Yeah.
Yeah, some of his stuff is really interesting too, about, you know, using math to show that consciousness is the base of everything. In the context of what I've seen firsthand through the breakthrough dose work, I was taken to a place where nothing exists. I didn't exist. There was but this one consciousness. And I was given a couple questions and a couple answers. If you were God, what would you ask yourself? If you were the creator of everything, the knower of everything, what could you ask yourself? And that's when I experienced the Big Bang, the creation of space and time and all that exists. God created everything to understand what it is. And everything is this consciousness of God interacting with itself to find out what it is. So the table in front of us, the air we breathe, everything that we think are all the basis of existence. Maybe another way of saying a simulation that God is running using itself as
God's a scientist.
Yeah.
God is a DJ.
God is everything, literally everything, right? So it's... I really believe that eventually we'll be able to get to the point of science where you're not just looking at what I call the meat puppet, you know, and the things that people have spoke of for ever, generations, the feeling that there is something more to this existence, your soul, ghosts, interdimensional creatures that people would either consider gods or aliens or some of the like really weird stuff that people talk on psychedelics. To me, that's all real. And the limitation is exactly what you're saying, is the tools that we have aren't the best at looking at what everything is there. They're looking at this meat puppet. They have limitations of what they're looking at of this meat puppet. And there's a real possibility that there is so much more than this physical existence that we experience.
Yeah. I mean, we're bound by our tools, aren't we? You know, telescope comes along and then we got a different view of our relationship to planetary bodies, and we're not the center of the universe and so on. And, you know, microscope comes along and we discover germ theory and learn about sanitation, and people start living longer and so on. And so, you know, these tools, they're very powerful. They broaden our view of of reality, but they don't stop. Then new telescopes created that could be sent into space, and
right. And we actively see that on a regular basis these days of new imaging of parts of the universe.
Aren't they incredible? Seeing live footage from Mars and the sound from Mars and so on is wild. Yeah, so we're bound by our tools, but we're also liberated by them. And we see further because of them. So,
well, and they're really important. Without the ability for us to test the potency of mushrooms, for example, before we were doing the testing, and the way a lot of people traditionally will talk about them, and even the way I still somewhat think about them, if you're going to get what you need, and
not what you want, but what you need.
Right. So, you take the mushrooms, and if you needed a really strong dose, those will happen to have been really strong mushrooms. But now that there's the science to look at the potency, and one of the other crazy things that we found is that even within the same tub that they're growing, a mushroom right next to each other, there can be 100% difference in potency.
Yeah.
So one mushroom might be 10,000 micrograms, the other might be 20,000. So it really is, if you're just dealing with the mushrooms, you're just trusting that whatever amount you take is actually going to be the amount that you meant to take.
It's hard, isn't it? And in that context, you might make a case for psilocybin, because at least you can kind of pin it down and know what the dose is and feel confident about that much at least.
Yeah. Well, and that's for at the church you can get mushroom powder as a sacrament that we've homogenized and tested, so you can use our little calculator to know exactly how much psilocybin you're consuming. And any chocolate bars or any other edible sacrament that you would get from the church, we no longer let people put the amount of grams of mushrooms on them. We want to know what the active components are, is how much psilocybin, how much baeocystin, how much psilocin, and that breakdown kind of gives you more options to control the experience. Because although there's definitely a body weight ratio, there's a bunch of different factors, and some people have more of a tolerance or less of a tolerance based on their body chemistry and their brain chemistry. But once this is what 20 milligrams will do to me, or 10 milligrams will do to me as an individual, then you'll be able to predict it, and you could know, like, oh, okay, well, I want to have the experience where I'm at a music festival and it feels like the musicians are floating off the stage, but and I'm totally into the vibe, but I'm totally safe, right? Versus now I'm going to leave my body, and who knows who's going to find it.
Yeah. I think that self-calibrating is a good way to go about things. We toyed with that being a way to do the trials, and maybe in time it could be a way to do a treatment model, that's developed to FDA approval, where you take an initial tester dose to calibrate your own sensitivity, or the clinician does that for you, probably better. And then from that, you maybe follow. I know people might think it's clunky to be algorithmic, but I would say, maybe certain, curanderas work this way. They test you with a small cup of ayahuasca, say ayahuasquero, what have you, and then calibrate from there. So it's not so clunky. It might seem algorithmic in the context of a scientist saying it, but actually there might be a deep wisdom and a logic to it. And this is, again, I say we're scratching the surface about the human neuroscience. We're also sure there's deep wisdom to respect in terms of how psychedelic plant medicines have been used for generations. But we're also, in a sense, scratching the surface of how we can fit this into Western society and civilization. Obviously, that's not an easy one, because we haven't cracked it,
Well, and there's all the propaganda that has come out over the years and years of the war on drugs, and that all drugs are bad, and something is bad just because it's a drug that makes people feel happy. And, that's... there's.
It's a mess, isn't it? I mean, wars divide. That's what they do. So you get the proponents, you get the opponents, and they go to extremes, and they say psychedelics send you crazy, one dose and you're whatever, one-way ticket to insanity or whatever. Then proponents could go too far and say one-way ticket to enlightenment, you'll be a better being, and turn on, tune in, drop out, and so on. These are extremes, and I think war, the sort of, even phrasing it that way has done a real disservice to the subtlety and the nuance of psychedelics. And they deserve that.
Well, and especially like just putting everything together. Cannabis is a different substance, and it reacts completely differently than psilocybin, and that's completely different than crack or meth or heroin. And
I couldn't agree more. And some people, whether it's a political move or what, they talk about psychedelic exceptionalism, say, but they're a category that's distinct from other drugs. I think it would be quite sloppy and lazy to just talk about drugs in general. I would say, in a sense, that's been one of the mistakes of the drugs war, to lump it all in. As it's been a very clumsy, heavy-handed approach to psychedelics through the drugs war that has threw them into Schedule 1 and so on. Even more tightly controlled than heroin or fentanyl. It's ridiculous.
It really is insane that cocaine is Schedule 2, but marijuana and psilocybin are Schedule 1. Which I'm not hating on anybody that likes using cocaine. There's plenty of pros and cons with that drug too, but the fact that that's considered less of a problem than cannabis is just baffling. And I think it does a huge disservice for the war itself if the war was actually to protect people, because then you try cannabis and you're like, oh, well, this isn't so bad, so maybe I've been lied to about everything else.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah.
Versus if we just had a conversation, like alcohol is probably one of the worst, and on that level marijuana is probably safer than that, but there's different risk levels for each of them, and certain ones like heroin, the Portugal has done the best thing ever, which is if you're a heroin addict, you can get heroin free from a doctor. So now who sells heroin, and where do all the heroin addicts go? That no one can sell it because the price is zero, and all the people who have a medical need and a problem around it go see a doctor. And that's how you solve the war on drugs. You don't throw those people in. You don't throw them in jail, right? You destroy the market. And you make sure that the people who are supplying the market, if it's something that's destroying their lives, they have a way to get treatment and help and get the drug just so that nobody sells it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. I mean, the black market is where so much of the problem is through, say, the violence and all sorts of things, people trafficking and environmental destruction. It's pretty dark, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and those are some of the darkest sides, but even some of the less dark sides are still big problems, like not knowing, again, the chocolate bars that one would be able to get from the church tell you exactly how much psilocybin's in them. If you're doing something that just says, oh, there's an eighth in there, or there's 5 grams in there, is it 5 grams of the really strong ones, or is it 5 grams of the really weak ones? Because 5 grams of the really strong ones, that's going to be dangerous for even me to consume, right? And 5 grams of the really weak ones, you might not even notice it. So there's a lot of problems by just making everything illegal and then putting people in jail, because
it's sort of preaching ignorance. What do they say? There's none so blind as those that dare not see. It's like, all the subtlety, all the sophistication, things like set and setting get lost when drugs are bad, psychedelics are bad. So, the other side, the sort of anti-capitalist lobby might say, yes, but the other market, the mainstream market has its own problems. And well, yes, it does. But this could seem naive, but if it's above ground, there's many eyes on it, and regulation can control things, and science can better interact with that space and bring in, public health messaging and evidence-based public health messaging, like happened with alcohol and, drink driving, for example. So sure, it ain't perfect, but the current system's pretty awful.
It's horrible. And, I'm not somebody that uses cocaine. I've got a heart condition that makes me it makes stimulants extra dangerous for me. But if you look at something like that, by keeping it illegal, the one thing that everybody who's ever done it knows, they don't know what's in it, right? Because if it was pure, they would die from the same line.
Right.
And typically what you see on the streets is somewhere all the way down to 5%, sometimes up to like 20% max. But if that's what you're used to, well, you got somewhere between 80 to 95% of some random substance that might be baby powder or baby formula, or I've even heard of titanium dioxide because it's heavy and it's white.
So bad if it's pure, bad if it's cut.
Right. Exactly. And then the other big thing is there fentanyl in it?
Right. And then it could be fatal in even lower doses. Yeah. It really is a mess. And then you also have, how does cocaine affect an individual? We once did a study measuring ego by 2 dimensions: ego inflation, wink, wink, cocaine, and ego dissolution, psychedelics. So, and then we threw in alcohol because we thought it'd be an interesting control. Lo and behold, people's cocaine use dose dependently shoots them up the ego inflation dimension.
Wow.
Psychedelics.
I would have never guessed that.
Yeah, I know. It's 'cause sometimes science is just an exercise in demonstrating the bloody obvious, my English friends would say. And then, dose dependently psychedelics, ego dissolution. But it was a neat way to pass between these drugs. Alcohol fell in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'd predict. But...
If that's what these drugs do to an individual, a very interesting question here. What do they do to groups of individuals? What do they do to society? What kind of society do you want? Do you want stockbrokers, going wild on cocaine? Or do you want, I'm idealizing here, but, long-bearded Taoist person, who's turned on through psychedelics. This is very idealistic here, who's more humble and more living harmoniously with other beings and nature and so on. I mean, that's the ideal with psychedelics. Often it doesn't go that way, but, what are ideals for if not aspiring to them?
Well, and again, it has a lot to do with the set and setting. If you're going into a dose of really any psychedelic with the mindset and the right setting that this is a religious ceremony, versus you're doing it at a party, you're going to get different results.
Yeah.
And
what drugs would you want to your party?
Yeah.
Cocaine, ego inflation.
Yeah.
The individual might want that. I don't know.
I mean, personally, I don't like to party with psychedelics. The only time I do it is, in this ceremony space. Sure. Yeah. Right. Well, some people do, and. At Burning Man, maybe I'll eat a little bit, and just so everything looks a little funnier. But it's got to be the right set and setting. You got to know what you're doing. But
or an empathogen,
MDMA or something like that. I mean, it's, and I would say also it depends on the type of party too, right? Because an MDMA party is definitely different than a cocaine party versus an alcohol party, or just a sober. Everybody's just getting together to hang out and just. There's all these different ways, ways to use it in different. I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but it's where do you want to be? And the stimulants tend to, in addition to ego inflation, build the paranoia more than anything else, right? I mean, I've talked to people that were on meth benders who were just absolutely sure that the government was following them around, and that the cops were around the corner every time they turned, and they locked themselves in the house because the mafia was coming to get them, and it's all in their head. There's nothing going on, but if I could live in a world where people didn't get into that state, I think it would be a much better world.
Yeah, methamphetamine and the problem with psychotic disorders, in the Bay and across the US and beyond. It's really sad.
Yeah.
And it's a stimulant action that's driving that.
Yeah, well, and it's it's one of those things where the war on drugs has just completely failed, and you can't solve these problems by locking people up.
No,
you have to solve them with treatment,
or leaving them on the streets.
That doesn't solve anything, right?
Yeah.
You need treatment and programs to get them into a better place.
Yeah, and it's a really hard problem, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think we've gone well over an hour at this point, so we should probably wrap it up. So the studies that you have coming up, is there anything for people to find out more? Where should we send them?
Probably to my website, carhart-harrislab.com, all one word apart from the .com. So no hyphen in Carhart-Harris Lab. And there we at the moment we just list our set and setting study, the I2 study, that deep sampling study. We didn't need to advertise because it's kind of a small sample and we just need to find the right people. But I've told people about it and we still need 2 more. And then the other one that's coming, we might call it Psychedelic Survey. That's a bit sort of prosaic and unimaginative. It needs to... We call it Cohort 3 Breezy for brief and easy, and then Babs Bay Area Brains for people who want to come in and have their brain scanned, who are turning on to magic mushrooms for the first time. So, but I'll advertise that, and people will find it on my website. So carhart-harrislab.com.
And we're in touch. So when you actually have somewhere for me to direct people to, I'll definitely make sure all our members get that.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of potential there as far as being able to study psychedelics in the wild. And we just hit 125,000 members.
Amazing.
Who have physically come through the church to get cannabis, mushrooms, or DMTs. So that we got a lot of people that would be interested in giving some feedback to science, I'm sure.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you for everything that you're doing. I mean, it's really important that people are actually looking into the science of these different things and trying to understand it. Even though, your tools might not be perfect, they're the best tools that we have right now. Yeah. And the more that we can learn about these things, the better.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because you're going to be speaking at 420 at our upcoming conference, which is Spirituality and Beyond. It's the church's annual Easter event. This year it just happens to line up with 419, which is Bicycle Day, and 420, which is also Easter and the anniversary of the Marsh Chapel experiment, where they first did the study of, does psilocybin invoke a religious experience? So for the church, it's going to be really significant, and I can't wait to have you on the stage over there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on this, and thank you for having me come to your event as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, it's been great talking to you.
Pleasure.